The studio reserves IDF Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, the former international spokesperson for the IDF and now a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Ariel Osran, our Middle East correspondent. And Jonathan, the recovery of Farhan al-Qadi from within a tunnel. Does that give any kind of sense of hope, perhaps, about either, and also some of the intelligence that he's said to be providing, perhaps further rescue operations? Or does even just his call, for example, to Prime Minister Netanyahu to go ahead and try to make a deal at this stage impact on either of those possibilities?
Yes, good evening. One would hope so, but I remain pessimistic about both accounts. The ability to get out, rescue more Israeli hostages by the IDF, as gallant and as tremendous it is when we see Israeli troops going in, risking their lives, getting Israelis out, Muslims and Jews as one, which I think is something that's worthy of mention. But at the end of the day, with all this excellent activity, 8 Israelis have been rescued by Israeli security forces, and there are still 108 left, and I do not think that we will get a significant number of those home by military action. Second part of your question, doesn't look like it. It looks as if the priorities of the Israeli government are not to do what you said, but are different. And even though the entire defense establishment has said repeatedly that it is possible to disengage temporarily from the Philadelphia corridor and reposition troops in such a way in order to facilitate the deal, that hasn't happened. Of course, on the other side of the table, we have a murderous and ruthless terror organization that doesn't care at all about the fate and the life of people. But at the end of the day, if it really hangs on an Israeli decision, which I don't entirely think it does, I do not see that happening anytime soon, and I don't see even the moving words of Farhan al-Qadi having a difference.
All right. Well, let's hope maybe that there will be some let's hope for some hope for hopeful,
yes, let's hope.
Hopeful signs. But let's stay focused on Gaza for the moment. The challenge of getting sufficient humanitarian aid to the civilian population of Gaza during Israel's military operation against Hamas has been a vexing problem from the start. And perhaps no single initiative in that effort better symbolizes the difficulties and misconceptions involved than the now defunct pier off the Gaza coast that should have been enabled supplies brought into the Strip from the sea. Now a new report suggests that project was likely doomed from the start. This amid new warnings from the UN over the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Robert Swift has the details.
An internal U.S. report reveals that President Joe Biden ordered the construction of a military pier to provide aid into Gaza, despite concerns about the viability of the operation from the outset. U.S. International Development Agency staff warned that the pontoon was liable to fail and would undermine diplomatic efforts to force Israel to grant land access to Gaza for the entry of aid. The mission was enacted and subsequently cancelled after a total of 20 days in operation, following repeated security and weather-related problems, having distributed less than a third of its intended cargo at a cost of $230 million.
The sailors, Marines, merchantmen, soldiers are all behind this mission because they see they are making a difference for the people of Gaza.
This mission's failure highlights the continuous struggle to address aid concerns over the last 10 months of combat inside Gaza. The UN blames Israel for bottlenecking aid distribution, and earlier this week stressed that threats of Israeli attacks against aid staff and evacuation orders are severely hampering its ability to distribute food.
Humanitarian aid delivery continues, a tremendous feat given that we are operating at the uppermost peripheries of tolerable risk. Mr. Michaud underscores that humanitarians have been in the crosshairs throughout this crisis, which is by far the deadliest on record for the United Nations.
An IDF order to evacuate Deir al-Balagh, where UN staff were quartered, was highlighted as particularly disrupting, coming days before a polio vaccination drive for 600,000 plus children. The Israeli military blames the humanitarian crisis in Gaza on Hamas and has pointed the finger at the UN's distribution capabilities. Its COGAT unit is assisting in the polio inoculation campaign. On Tuesday, the IDF noted that it sees the aid problems in Gaza as an important aspect of its continued fight against Hamas, and that it has assigned a brigadier general to oversee such activities.
And Ariel, the fundamental issue here is security. This is a war zone, and all these attempts to address it, and for example, we should note Hamas or other terror groups did, for example, make attacks on the pier and on the equipment coming out of the pier, and this is a fundamental problem that's not going to be solved simply by a bureaucratic solution.
And the thing is, this isn't the real solution for the problem, because what is the problem? Not bringing aid to the Gaza Strip or even bring it into the Gaza Strip. It's distributing it in the Gaza Strip, in the various areas. And once it gets into the Gaza Strip, obviously, a lot of these convoys are commandeered by Hamas terrorists or by their different thugs. Now, this is also something that groups themselves have admitted to. Now, another reason this pier was established is because the challenge for aid getting in, which a second ago I said wasn't a problem, it's become a problem. Why? Because Egypt stopped bringing in aid through the Rafah crossing. That was the main avenue through which convoys of trucks would go into until Israeli forces took control over the Philadelphia corridor and the Rafah crossing. Egypt decided it is no longer bringing aid through there, and it's up to the world to decide through where to bring it in. I will just note that there is a kind of a loophole that from the Rafah crossing, they do cross into Israel through Kerem Shalom, and then they go in from there. So even the Egyptian solution is more of an illusion, you can say, as opposed to a real shun of Israeli forces. But at the end of the day, we see that everyone is focusing on what appears to be the problem, or what is presented as the problem by aid groups themselves working inside, whereas the real challenge is once the aid that can get to the Gaza Strip, how does it get from its borders into where it is most needed, mainly the north, mainly the concentration of where about 1.5 million Palestinians are. That's south of Deir el-Balach, north of Khan Yunis. That is the problem, that is the issue, and that is not something that this American pier, even if it were successful, it wouldn't have addressed that problem.
And Jonathan, Hamas says try to hamper the aid effort. The UN has been effective in administrating it. But the IDF and Israel has to take this into account, because ultimately this is part of the information war which you were part of in terms of sustaining the Gaza offensive to try to get that aid distributed in Gaza.
It is definitely part of what allows Israel the legitimacy and the freedom to operate, and it's very important. And it's also the right thing to do. When you are combating in an area, you need to provide the basic needs of the population there. And that's a responsibility that the IDF accepts and tries to implement. I think the idea, the pier, it was maybe a good idea, but to me, and I said this on the air at the time, it looked very much like a political decision that was made top-down in the US without consulting with people on the ground, without consulting really with the IDF, and then the president declared it, and it came into being, and then everybody scrambled to turn it into reality, and sadly, it is discontinued because it didn't work. It tells the story of how difficult it is to get aid into a densely populated urban area where a terrorist organization still rules and still governs. It is very challenging, and I agree with what Ariel says about the core issues. I'll add one more thing. It could have been different if Israel had had a humanitarian plan from day one. And I think that we didn't have a well enough formulated humanitarian plan that supplemented the maneuver and the combat operations together with information operations. We could have done it a bit differently. That's in the past, and what's important now is to get these operations in good gear and speed. And at the end of the day, until Hamas is ousted from power and until other organizations, be they Israeli or non-Israeli, can distribute aid, Hamas will stay in power.
All right, then we see Kogod assisting in the polio with probably the best qualified Israeli agency to deal with it, trying to help in getting those vaccinations done in the Gaza Strip. Well, let's move now from Gaza to the West Bank. A major IDF anti-terror operation overnight in Jenin and Tulkarem has reportedly left at least 10 Palestinians dead, in one more sign that the security situation in the West Bank is becoming even more tense as Israeli forces try to keep it from boiling over, while of course remaining deeply engaged on both the Gaza and Lebanon fronts. Our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osseron takes a closer look at developments there.
A large-scale operation in the northern West Bank, described as the most significant Israeli raid there in years. The counterterrorism operation, launched early Wednesday by IDF, Shin Bet, and border police forces, is expected to last a few days.
Israeli forces usually storm in violently, but last night was particularly violent, as they used all available military means, from helicopters to fighter jets. It carried out an airdrop, used drones to target a group of residents, and stormed the camp from several directions.
According to the IDF, the operation is largely focused in the areas of Jenin and Tulkarem, but troops were also carrying out activities in the Farah camp near Tubas. The mission, to arrest terror suspects and to uncover and dismantle dozens of explosive devices planted beneath the roads to target Israeli forces.
العملية الإسرائيلية الغاشمة المستمرة في مدينة جنين ومخيم جنين. هذه العملية تختلف عن سابقاتها من العمليات والاقتحامات السابقة، إنه لغاية الآن يتم إغلاق جميع مداخل مدينة جنين ويمنع الدخول والخروج منها.
The forces encircled 2 hospitals in Jenin and 2 others in Tulkarem to prevent terrorists from fleeing to them, as usually happens. At least 10 Palestinian gunmen were killed in a series of drone strikes and clashes with Israeli forces. They were all affiliated with local terror groups. The operation comes amid the resurging threat of explosive attacks originating from the West Bank. Such concerns recently peaked after a failed suicide bombing in Tel Aviv last week. The terrorist who prematurely blew himself up came from another terror nest in the northern West Bank, Nablus. But surprisingly, it hasn't been included in the current operation, at least not yet. Instead, Palestinian Authority security forces were seen deployed in the area in large numbers. In light of the large-scale operation, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas even cut short his trip to Saudi Arabia. Abbas's spokesperson warned that the raids will have, quote, dangerous consequences in which everybody will pay a price.
And Jonathan, the situation in the West Bank getting serious. We even had Foreign Minister Israel Katz today, making headlines with a proposal that Israel evacuate certain areas, create evacuation zones in the West Bank, as the IDF is doing in Gaza. I don't know if that is even a practical idea, or a right idea, or a moral idea. What's your perspective from your experience?
Yeah, I think that the IDF made pretty clear that there are no such orders or demands given to Palestinians anywhere, not in Tulkarem and not in Jenin. If anybody wants and feels out of fear, etc., that they want to relocate, the IDF will facilitate, but there has been no such orders. Now, that's been a very sensitive issue. Now, about what's going on, what we're seeing is an operation that really was long in the making. And in my mind, it's part of what needs to be done. And I think what triggered this is high-level IEDs that have been brought into Israel and almost successful suicide bombings. By the way, just now, a few minutes ago, Khaled Mashal, the overseas leader of Hamas, says that Hamas will go back to doing suicide bombings, which is an interesting statement from him. He said it on a televised recorded speech. But the bottom line is that I don't think that the security situation here will change for the better until Israel stops the flow of weapons that are coming in from Jordan.
Right, and some of it originating in Iran, many of them.
All of it is orchestrated by Iran. Some of it is purchased old American weapons from Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of it is bought elsewhere. But the bottom line is that it's being funneled into the northern part of Samaria by the Iranian Quds Force, with the sole purpose of escalating the situation in there, and of course against Israel. Until Israel effectively stops that from happening, we will see, I think, a steady incline in violent activity. Last thing, what I'm concerned with much about is that we're seeing a lot of wheeled vehicles, wheeled IDF vehicles, jeeps, etc. And the IDF can operate in such a way still, until our enemies will obtain anti-tank missiles and more sophisticated weapons. When and if that happens, the IDF will have to change its posture to a much more heavy and mechanized footprint, which will be a totally different thing, similar to how Israeli troops are operating in Gaza, because there they have access to high-level anti-tank weapons. In Judea and Samaria, they do not yet have that. But if the border stays open and porous, it's a question of when, not if. I hope Israel will be able to prevent that from happening.
Well, we already are seeing much more use of airstrikes and drone strikes, something that until a couple of years ago we only really saw
overall escalation
in Gaza.
Definitely.
All right. Well, we are going out for a brief break. Jonathan Conricus, Ariel Osuran, please stay with us. Lots more coming up on the rundown. We'll be back in just a few minutes, so stay with us.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back to the Rundown on I24 News. Let's focus now on the Lebanon front, with air raid sirens ringing out this evening in several communities there in northeast Israel. The IDF also hitting back across the Syrian border, acknowledging that it carried out a drone strike against a senior operative of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror group there. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu paid a visit today to Northern Command and troops stationed on the border, promising that a successful defense against the big Hezbollah attempted attack earlier this week is not the end of the story in that conflict. Well, for more, let's go to our correspondent in northern Israel, Nicole Tzedek. And Nicole, first of all, just update us. We saw sirens just in the past hour there in the north.
Yes, we've seen sirens blaring 2 times throughout the day, Kalev, which, as we know, 2 times is too many. However, compared to some of the past several months even, this is a little bit less frequent than what we've seen. Now, the IDF says that several projectiles were launched in both of these different times earlier in the day during the first sirens in the Upper Galilee, specifically the Kiryat Shmona, Margalit, Manera areas right there on the border with Lebanon and Syria. One projectile was launched earlier in the day. It fell in an open area. Then a few hours later, during that second round of alarms, 2 projectiles were launched towards Kiryat Shmona, and both of those also fell in open areas, not causing any injuries or damage, according to the initial reports from both the municipality and from the IDF. Now, the IDF is still striking back inside southern Lebanon. The fighter jets throughout the day have struck a building where they noticed Hezbollah operatives were stationed at. Fighter jets were able to strike that also in other areas throughout southern Lebanon, striking different Hezbollah observation posts, and even some of these different Hezbollah terror infrastructures not right along the southern Lebanese border, a little bit further inside southern Lebanon, about 20 kilometers from the border. So these fighter jets are continuing to operate there. But as you mentioned, it's not only these operations that are happening inside Lebanon, which we see on a day-to-day basis, and the IDF is quick to mention those, but something a little bit more rare that we saw earlier in the day, the IDF commenting and claiming responsibility for a drone strike in Syria. A group of 4 terrorist operatives that were traveling along the Beirut-Damascus highway in Syria heading towards Lebanon, according to the IDF. And inside this vehicle, there were 3 Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists and 1 Hezbollah operative. Now, the most senior official, according to the IDF, was a member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad who was a pretty high-up member in their operations unit, not only planning different operations for terrorists inside Syria and Lebanon, but also helping the Hezbollah terror group recruit different members from Palestinian territories and actually come to Lebanon to carry out some of these attacks. The IDF says over the past several years, this is something that they're seeing more and more frequently, specifically with the funding from Iran. Iran funding Hezbollah to recruit some of these Palestinian terrorists to then conduct operations from Lebanon towards northern Israel. So according to the IDF, this group of 4 operatives was traveling from Syria to Lebanon to then conduct some more operations in Lebanon. So that's why they targeted them and claimed responsibility for the attack.
All right, Nicole Tzedek there in northern Israel. Thank you for that. And still with us, we have Jonathan Conricus and our Ariel also. And interesting, as what Nicole's saying, Israel acknowledging a strike on Syrian soil, but as she was saying, the circumstances somewhat different, and it ties in a little with what Jonathan says, which is that terror groups trying to infiltrate into Israel, bringing arms or attacks, and maybe, in a sense, Israel saying this is crossing a red line in the rules of the game, and so that's why we're going to acknowledge this strike.
I think in the case of this specific strike, it's the opposite. It's the Palestinian terror groups exporting their activity to elsewhere around Israel's borders to continue in this attempted chokehold that they're trying to place Israel under, obviously, the auspices and guidance funding of Iran. Now, I think it is interesting that the majority of targets that Israel has struck in terms of personalities have not been Syrians, but have been Palestinian militias or Hezbollah, and that illustrates how, if we talked about this Iranian axis over the years and Iran's entrenchment in Syria, you would expect Syria to be more active in what's going on and even participate in these promised retaliations that we're seeing coming from the Iranian axis. I think it is interesting that Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, has chosen to sit this one out, so to speak. Also, given the fact that today, when you talk about Syria, you cannot disconnect it from Russia and its interests. Today in the region, people refer to Syria as Russia's Middle East outpost, and so that is one thing. But also different talk that we're hearing regarding Syria's involvement and even Hezbollah's involvement vis-a-vis Iran. That Iran had asked Hezbollah to lower its response against Israel in order to give ceasefire talks a chance. On the flip side of that, there is a lot of frustration between Tehran and Damascus that Syria is not getting more involved. Obviously, as we saw today, they are a base of operations for different Palestinian territories.
Let's say a silent
and
partner
Hezbollah,
in some way,
but they're not taking an active part here. And I think that is interesting to note, given that Israel is indeed in a multi-front war. Syria is one of those 7 fronts, but the Syrian regime is not as invested in the game as, so to speak, as the other of Iran's
Well,
proxies.
also maybe reflects insecurity on Bashar al-Assad's part. He's got other issues within his own country that are challenging his role there, so he's in a precarious position. Now, the body that is supposed to be keeping the peace along Lebanon's border with Israel is UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Forces in Lebanon, which is tasked with enforcing UN Resolution 1701 that mandates Hezbollah being kept back from the border. Now, today, the UN Security Council had a vote to renew UNIFIL's mandate for another year. For more on that, let's go to our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim, in Washington, D.C. And Mike, the headline is, of course, Security Council did renew that mandate, but I guess the biggest story is to what purpose?
To what purpose? Yeah, France is the pen holder on this particular issue. They are the ones that kind of oversee the drafting of the resolutions when it pertains to Lebanon. They wanted to keep this resolution short, concise. They didn't want any kind of obstacles in the way. In past negotiations, there's been some tensions over UNIFIL's freedom of movement, how much bite they should have, how much juice they should have in trying to force Hezbollah to open up certain areas to inspection and things of that nature. France wasn't looking for a fight this time, so they kept things short and sweet, and it was approved unanimously. There really wasn't a whole lot of contention, but among the points that were disputed were this, according to our sources. Number one, the U.S. wanted a condemnation of Hezbollah explicitly in the resolution. That didn't go through. The U.S., though, was able to thwart language that would have tied future negotiations between Israel and Lebanon on the border to the 1949 Armistice Agreement, which is pretty solid in its contours. The U.S. wanted Israel to have some wiggle room in its negotiations along the border if they ever happen. Now, the U.S. is trying to push those negotiations forward. They wanted something specifically in the resolution about that, saying that the Security Council recommends the following of a U.S. initiative on border negotiations. Several council members thwarted that, and it wasn't included in the final document passed today unanimously. Now, Danny Danon, once again, Israeli ambassador to the UN, addressed the press before the Security Council went to a vote. He basically said, hey, essentially the Security Council hasn't really done much about this problem. He had a warning for the Lebanese people specifically. They need to take care of Hezbollah and take care of him quickly. Here's Danny Danon in New York earlier today.
I have a message for the Lebanese people. You and your government have a choice to make. Confront Hezbollah today or watch as your country is dragged into chaos and destruction. The time for action is now. Do not let Hezbollah and Iran dictate your future. If you fail to act, the devastation that follows will be on your hands. Israel does not seek war, but as we demonstrated this week, we will not hesitate to defend our people. We will not tolerate Hezbollah firing rockets at our citizens. The time for the international community to act is now.
You know, Mike, stay with us. I want to go in the studio here, first of all, to Jonathan Conricus. You've, of course, had to deal with this issue with the UNIFIL. The point is, never mind whether it's even doing anything for the good. Is it doing more harm than good, just being there and maybe providing some kind of a cover for Hezbollah, so to speak, by just being there in South Lebanon?
Sadly, I mean, I served as an IDF liaison officer to UNIFIL for 2.5 years, so I have some experience with them. In as much as so many people would have wanted UNIFIL to be a solution or be part of the solution, I think that today, after October the 7th, I think it's very clear to anybody who has the minimal amount of honesty to really address and say a complete and utter failure in preventing exactly what Security Council Resolution 1701 was supposed to prevent, and that is the chances of a third war between Israel and Hezbollah. Today, Hezbollah is armed, dangerous, present in southern Lebanon, everything in violation of 1701. And believe me, I've read more than one Security Council report on the topic. If you read UNIFIL reports over the years and you compare it with reality, speaking about more bad than good, you could really think, if you'd rely on UN reports, that everything in southern Lebanon is more or less okay. A little bit of unfriendly behavior towards UN troops, which is UN language for Hezbollah people actively harassing and stopping UNIFIL from patrolling, and then UNIFIL not reporting on reality on the ground. And that is one of the reasons, not the main and only reason, but one of the reasons why we find ourselves with a total violation of 1701, and Israel and Lebanon and the region being at the cusp of war again.
Ariel.
Yeah, I agree that their presence there gives the illusion that there is a diplomatic solution in play, and that allows Hezbollah to continue and undermine it in a way that they have lost all attempts to even hide it. In his speech earlier this week, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, boasted at how rockets were launched at Israel from south of the Litani River and north of the Litani River. He is publicly admitting to breaking Resolution 1701. It's not the first time. And the thing is, for 18 years this has been going on, and when everyone, with all the international community calling on Israel to reach a diplomatic solution regarding its threat in the north, a diplomatic solution, first of all, there is one in place, 1701, it's not being enforced, but this is what a diplomatic solution would look like. So in the absence of this working, Israel, unfortunately, is being led against its will to only one solution, because the diplomatic solution has failed consistently since 2006.
And Mike, any voices in the U.S. basically suggesting maybe we shouldn't support UNIFIL just as a protest for the exactly what Jonathan and Ariel are pointing out?
Not within the Biden administration. The Biden admin has tried to put a happy face on whatever the UN's been doing at any particular time. They've really had very little criticism of UNIFIL in particular along the way. I spoke just a month or two ago with Jean-Pierre Lacroix. He's the top peacekeeping official within the UN, the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations. I asked him specifically, as these negotiations on the mandate were approaching, what could be done to help UNIFIL? What tools could be given to them by the Security Council to help them do their job better? He demurred, really didn't want to get into specifics, but he said ultimately it's not up to the Security Council, which was quite eye-opening. He said it's up to Israel and the other parties, that being Hezbollah and presumably the Lebanese government, though they're obviously not in any position to do anything at the moment. You're leaving it up to Israel and Hezbollah to solve the problem. This is where we are right now, and that's the crux of the UN at the moment. Leave it to somebody else to fix it.
Well, maybe it has to be with Israel and a Lebanese government that effectively takes control of its own sovereignty and its own soil at some point in the future, perhaps. But we won't hold our breath waiting. Mike Wagenheim in Washington, thank you for that. And moving back to Israel, calls for new elections have grown here in recent months following anger over the failure of Prime Minister Netanyahu to reach a hostage deal, critics charging him with trying to delay the issue in order to keep his government intact. But if there were elections, just how much change would there really be? I24 News, together with the Magar Mochot Institute, conducted a survey of the Israeli public looking at possible election results and other issues related to the war with Hamas. Joe Brown checks out the results, which may surprise some.
It's been almost 2 years since Israel's last elections, in which the Benjamin Netanyahu-led coalition of right-wing parties defeated the left-centre bloc, led by Yair Lapid, in order to form Israel's 37th government. But since then, a lot has changed. From outcry over the proposed judicial reforms to the October 7th massacre and anger over the government's response, the Israeli political landscape is completely different from 2 years ago. But if an election was held now, how would Israelis vote? I24 News conducted a poll with the Magar Mochot Institute to gauge the opinion of the Israeli public. Over 600 people took part in the poll between August 26th and 27th. Despite the backlash against him and his government, if elections were held today, Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party would still be the largest in the Knesset with 22 seats, one more than Benny Gantz's National Unity Party. The next three largest parties, Yisrael Beitenu, Yesh Atid, and the newly formed Democrats Party, would all likely join Benny Gantz's party in a coalition to oust the government to make a combined 57 seats in the Knesset. This would be larger than Netanyahu's bloc of 52 seats, but not enough to reach the 60 needed for a Knesset majority. But in terms of popularity compared to his counterparts, the incumbent Prime Minister still comes out on top. 53% of respondents said that Netanyahu would be a more suitable Prime Minister than former Defence Minister Gantz, whilst 59% said that they would prefer a Netanyahu premiership to a Lapid one. But what if former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was added to the equation? Speculation has been rife about the former leader's return to politics, and he was the only politician polled who was deemed more suitable for the position than his former political foe Netanyahu. Furthermore, if he were to run in the elections, his hypothetical new party would trounce Netanyahu in the polls, receiving 27 seats and reducing Netanyahu's Likud to 18 seats. The poll also asked about people's thoughts on the war thus far. In response to this week's preemptive strikes on Lebanon, a majority of people did not think they were strong enough, with only a quarter of respondents saying they were either good enough or too much. For the hostage deal, the main sticking point is Israel's continued presence in the strategically important Philadelphia corridor. When asked if Israel should sign a deal, including leaving the Philadelphia corridor, almost half of the respondents said that the deal should be signed regardless. And finally, all in all, is Israel winning the war? Well, only 26% of people think so. A similar amount think that it is losing, whilst most people polled believe that Israel is neither winning nor losing the war. Polling is often a good indicator to the public's perception, but it has limitations. Not everyone in the country is asked, just a small group seen as representative. And whilst they may say one thing now, with the next election slated for 2027 and Israel's wars still not over, who knows what the public will think when they finally cast their ballots.
Joining us for more is Ariel Kahana, diplomatic correspondent of Israel Hayom, speaking to us from the community of Gever Binyamin. Ariel, my takeaways from those polls briefly are not bad news, pretty okay news for Prime Minister Netanyahu, bad news for Benny Gantz, good news for Naftali Bennett. So let's break it down. Let's start with Benjamin Netanyahu, because I think he has to be a little pleased with those. They're not great, but they're not bad results considering where he was a few months ago.
Hello, Kalev. It's always good to be with you. So, yeah, the numbers you show are actually the comeback of Bibi Netanyahu, because he's leading. And my sense is that in real elections, he will get even a little bit more. The numbers you showed regarding Bennett, actually, Bennett is getting his support from the center-left side. Okay, just because he's someone who can be prime minister and is not Bibi Netanyahu. But Bennett, we know what happens. The gaps that always happens with Bennett between the elections and then, between the polls and the elections. You always get much less Bennett, than what he got in the polls. So all in all of that, as you said, are good news for Netanyahu. And I'll tell you even more. Although Netanyahu, according to your poll and many others, although it shows that he's getting with his coalition only 52, the main point is that no one else can establish a new government, can establish a new coalition instead of Netanyahu. And that means if his bloc will go with him, and it looks his bloc will go with him. That tells you that if the government will fall and we will have elections, we might return to the endless election like we had until the winter of 2023, right? If I'm not wrong. Sorry, 2022, right? 2 years ago. So because it seems that Netanyahu is undefeated, but maybe he himself can't win. So we might come back to that awful years that we had, but it's very far to see. The government, I just tell you, the government is stable. Although all the problems you see, the government is stable.
Right. Well, that wouldn't be certainly having those endless elections during a wartime would not be welcome. But I think what also striking is what happened to Benny Gantz 6 months ago. He was the clear winner in all the polls. What was his big mistake now, looking in retrospect, seeing the results of this and other polls?
I think Benny Gantz made two significant mistakes. The first one was to leave the government during the war, going against the narrative of unity that he himself pushed from the beginning. So a lot of people, a lot of Israelis, let's say center-right, who liked what he did, joining the government after the beginning of this awful war, then left him because he left during the war. That's A. And secondly, look, Gantz, and actually any other leader who wants to win Netanyahu, the way to win Netanyahu is to bypass him from the right side, not from the center, not from the left. And that's the reason why Netanyahu he has this comeback. Because you mentioned Philadelphia, and rightfully it's a major issue. People on the right side see, yes, they are angry with Netanyahu because of the war. They blame him. They see him as responsible and so on. But still, he is the only one now to be the toughest guy in the neighborhood saying no for a deal, which includes withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor. And that's one of the main reasons why he gets back the numbers. I mean, Netanyahu, because once again, he is basing himself as a leader of the right side. He is right. He is very right to know that Israelis are in the right side of the political map. And that's the reason why he's coming back and why Benny Gantz is once again losing.
All right. Eric Kahana, thank you for that.
Bye-bye.
Jonathan, I want to talk about the poll questions relating specifically to conduct of the war, but because we see the government's not popular its policies in northern Israel. In terms of the hostage deal, even though polls have shown a majority wanting a hostage deal, when they're pressed for that specific answer of the Philadelphia corridor, even though, as you pointed out, the security establishment said that it could accept an agreement where troops don't stay in the corridor. The Israeli public is nervous about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no political expert or analyst. This is one poll, and I would take it with many grains of salt. It's interesting to see, but I would take it with many grains of salt. And what I hear and what I understand from Israelis and what they think and feel about how this war is being managed, for me, what's missing and what I hear, what's missing on the Israeli side is strategy and clear leadership of where we want to be. How do we end this war? How do we really defeat our enemies? And what's our plan for the very challenging situation that we're in? I don't see it, and I hear from family and friends who live up in the north and evacuated friends from the south and ordinary Israelis who are asking, okay, we're tough, we're resilient, but what is the Israeli plan? And that is exactly what a government is supposed to find. So I don't know about the results in this poll here, but maybe the question should be, are you satisfied with how the government is managing the war? And do you understand what the aims of the war are and how Israel is going to defeat its enemies? That, in my mind, is the most important thing. And to give directives to the security establishment what needs to be done and in what order of priority.
All right. But the question is whether any of the other candidates or parties are going to put forward a detailed strategy on that. I'm not sure we've really heard that, or that people have, those parties or politicians have put forward that kind of clear vision yet, which is why maybe Benjamin Netanyahu was certainly holding on to at least part of his base in the meantime.
I thought total victory is the clear goal that was set by the current government.
Well, total victory is the goal, but whether that's clear what total victory means, that's another story. We do have some breaking news out of Washington, D.C. area, which sounds like it could be pretty significant.
Out of Washington, D.C. via Beirut. This is reporting on MTV Lebanon. Citing American sources in the Pentagon saying that military attaches of Arab countries were summoned to the Pentagon in Washington and were informed of pending Iranian retaliation against Israel within the next 2 to 3 days, according to this Lebanese report. Now, this report, again, that cited American sources, said that the response would be limited and would not plunge the region into a comprehensive war. If so, that would be in line with Hezbollah's retaliation, albeit that was limited in its scope due to Israel's preemptive strike, that limited to a threshold that we have seen before. And in fact, Hezbollah had attacked Israel more significantly in a single day than it did over the weekend. But this is at least the latest indication regarding the Iranian promised retaliation over the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh on Iranian territory.
Let you know, this comes with some bellicose rhetoric in just the last couple of days from not just Iranian political leaders, but senior IRGC officials saying an Iranian response was inevitable. suggesting that perhaps Iran feels it will also have to make some kind of response. I'll give you the last word, Jonathan, in the last few seconds.
Yeah, I think that the Iranians have gone back to being clever, cool-headed, and smart strategic thinkers, and they aren't fooled to go out of the shadows and expose themselves to direct combat with the Israelis, direct confrontation with Israel, which they know that they will pay a heavy price for. They're back at using their proxies, which suits them, doesn't suit Israel. Israel should do everything possible to get them out of the shadows and fight.
All right, we'll leave on that note. Jonathan Conricus, Ariel Osran, thank you for joining us.